At a glittering charity gala filled with millionaires and cameras, no one moved when Cassian Drayke grabbed his pregnant wife by the hair and dragged her across the marble floor. Every guest saw it, but fear kept them frozen. Cassian had always looked like the perfect husband, but that mask was gone now. Then, as he raised his hand again, someone stopped him. A powerful grip locked around his wrist. It was Marco Leone, the Mafia Boss. No one dared to cross. And that night, he decided Cassian's cruelty would not continue. The night began like every other lavish event Cassian Drayke hosted. Expensive jewelry glimmered under chandeliers, and photographers captured forced smiles. Aurelia Drayke, 8 months pregnant, stood beside her husband, glowing on the surface, but terrified inside. She had learned to keep her voice soft and her eyes lowered, pretending life was perfect. Cassian spoke to powerful men about his new investments, his hand resting on her shoulder as if she were a prized accessory. She stayed still, praying the night would pass without incident, unaware this would be the night everything changed forever. Aurelia's long gown shimmered under the lights, the silver fabric barely hiding the bruises beneath her sleeves. She had spent hours covering them with makeup, fearing questions she couldn't answer. Cassian's reputation was spotless, built on charity galas and magazine features. To everyone else, he was the picture of elegance and generosity. But Aurelia knew what hid behind the mask, a temper that exploded over the smallest mistakes. As she smiled politely for the cameras, she kept her mind fixed on her unborn child, wishing only for a future far away from him. Cassian held his glass of champagne like a trophy, moving through the crowd with false warmth. He whispered compliments, exchanged cards, and laughed in perfect rhythm with those who mattered. Behind him, Aurelia followed quietly, nodding when expected, invisible in her own marriage. Every gesture was part of a performance, each smile a fragile mask, protecting her from public suspicion. When she caught her reflection in a mirror across the hall, she almost didn't recognize herself. The woman staring back seemed hollow, trapped inside the role of the millionaire's wife, who was never allowed to falter. As the orchestra played a soft tune, Cassian began to lose patience. A waiter stumbled near their table, nearly spilling red wine across his white tuxedo. Cassian's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile for the watching guests. His hand, however, twitched slightly, the same hand Aurelia had seen strike her countless times behind closed doors. The waiter apologized, trembling, and hurried away. Cassian's eyes found Aurelia's, his stare sharp and accusing. She knew that look. To him, her presence was the trigger, and any minor mistake around him was always somehow her fault. Aurelia excused herself quietly, trying to create space, but Cassian followed. He whispered harshly, low enough that only she could hear. His smile never left his face, but his words cut deep. The nearby guests assumed they were simply having a private conversation, unaware of the venom laced beneath his polite tone. Aurelia felt her heart sink. She knew what waited once the doors closed, and the crowd disappeared. Her every step back toward him felt heavier, but she had learned resistance only made things worse. Still, something inside her told her this night felt different. The tension broke when a photographer requested one last picture. Cassian forced a grin, his hand gripping Aurelia's waist too tightly as the flash went off. In that single frozen image, they looked perfect, a man of wealth and a glowing wife expecting their first child. But when the cameras turned away, Cassian's temper snapped. He yanked Aurelia by the arm, his voice sharp enough to make a nearby couple glance over. Then, without restraint, he grabbed her by the hair. Gasps rippled through the hall, yet not one person dared to step forward. Aurelia stumbled, her heels scraping against the marble floor. The crowd stared, uncertain if they should help or pretend nothing was happening. Cassian's reputation loomed like a warning. He shouted something under his breath and dragged her closer to the exit. Tears welled in Aurelia's eyes, but she refused to scream. Her body ached as she tried to protect her stomach with both hands. The orchestra stopped playing, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. The illusion of their perfect marriage shattered completely in front of the city's most powerful eyes. No one in the room moved. Cassian's money and influence had bought their silence long before this night. Even security hesitated, afraid to act against a man whose donations funded their very jobs. Aurelia's tears streaked down her face, mixing with the smudged makeup she had so carefully applied earlier. Every inch she was dragged felt endless. The glittering marble beneath her reflected her humiliation. Her breath came in short, painful bursts, but she said nothing. Then Cassian raised his hand ready to strike again, until another hand appeared and stopped him mid-swing. A powerful grip wrapped around Cassian's wrist, halting him. The sudden contact startled him more than any sound could. He turned, ready to lash out, but froze when he saw who it was. Marco Leone stood before him, dressed in a black suit that made the air feel heavier. His name alone carried enough weight to silence entire rooms. People whispered stories about him. Some called him a criminal, others a savior, depending on which side of the law they stood. But in that moment, no one questioned whose presence truly held power. Marco's eyes stayed fixed on Cassian's hand, still clutched in his grasp. Without raising his voice, he made Cassian's dominance crumble. The entire room could sense the shift in control. Cassian's mouth opened, but no words came out. He tried to pull away, but Marco didn't let go until Aurelia was safely out of reach. The guests watched, stunned, realizing the man they once feared. Cassian was suddenly the one trembling. Marco released his grip and gave him a look that carried both disgust and warning, then turned his gaze toward Aurelia lying on the floor. Aurelia blinked, dazed, unsure what had just happened. The man towering over Cassian wasn't someone she recognized personally, but the name Marco Leone echoed through every rumor in the city. Cassian took a step back, his pride visibly cracking. His confidence faded under the Mafia Boss's stare. Marco bent slightly, offering Aurelia his hand. She hesitated, then took it, her fingers trembling. The crowd parted silently as he helped her to her feet. Cassian's fury boiled beneath his polished expression, but his fear kept him motionless in front of the man everyone avoided crossing. Marco signaled to one of his men near the entrance. A tall bodyguard stepped forward, gently taking Aurelia's arm. Marco spoke quietly to him, and the guard began escorting her out of the hall. Cassian's eyes darted between them, torn between his anger and the crushing awareness that he could do nothing. The guests began murmuring again, their phones raised discreetly to capture the scene. Cassian had built his reputation on perfection, and now it was collapsing in real time. Marco turned back toward him with calm finality, and Cassian felt smaller than ever before. The moment Aurelia stepped outside, the night air hit her like a shock. She could still hear faint music inside, as if the world continued pretending nothing had happened. The guard led her to a sleek black car waiting by the curb. Marco followed behind at a steady pace, his expression unreadable. Aurelia didn't know where they were taking her, or why he was helping. She only knew she couldn't return home. Her legs shook as she climbed into the back seat, the baby kicking faintly inside her, reminding her what she was truly fighting for. Inside the car, Aurelia sat silently, trying to process the chaos. Marco entered beside her and gave a quiet signal to the driver. The vehicle pulled away from the hotel without a word exchanged. Aurelia looked out the window at the fading city lights, unsure if she had escaped one prison only to enter another. Marco leaned back, his presence calm but commanding. He didn't ask questions or demand gratitude. The silence between them felt strange, almost safe. For the first time in years, Aurelia didn't feel like she was walking on broken glass. The ride felt endless, each turn taking them farther from the life she had known. When the car finally stopped, Aurelia saw high iron gates opening before them. Beyond them stood a grand estate, surrounded by tall hedges and guarded walls. She realized this was not an ordinary home. It was a fortress. Marco stepped out first, then offered her his hand again. His tone stayed even as he told her to rest. She didn't understand his intentions yet, but for reasons she couldn't explain, she believed she was safer here than anywhere else. Inside the ballroom, silence hung like a verdict. Marco stood still, his gaze locked on Cassian. The weight of that stare made Cassian's polished charm crumble into anger masked by embarrassment. Marco's presence was enough to remind everyone in that room who truly held power in this city. Cassian forced a thin smile, muttering excuses about misunderstandings and stress, but no one believed him. Marco didn't answer. He simply turned toward the door where Aurelia had been taken. Without saying a word, his decision was clear. This was not over, not tonight. Cassian's attempt to regain control failed miserably. Guests whispered behind their champagne glasses, pretending to check their phones. His lawyer tried to calm him, but Cassian's pride was already broken. Marco's silent defiance humiliated him more than any physical blow could. When Marco finally walked away, Cassian called after him, demanding he stay out of his marriage. Marco didn't even turn around. The crowd parted for him, respecting his power in a way Cassian had always demanded but never truly earned. Cassian's hands trembled with fury as he realized his image of dominance had shattered completely. Outside, Aurelia sat in the car, watching the city lights blur past. She felt detached, like she was floating outside her body. Everything she knew was unraveling, yet she couldn't bring herself to fear the man beside her. Marco leaned slightly forward, speaking softly to the driver, his tone calm but firm. The car glided through the quiet streets, toward the outskirts of the city. Aurelia wanted to ask where they were going, but the exhaustion in her body weighed heavier than curiosity. She only knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going back to Cassian. The car entered a long tree-lined driveway, leading to a secluded estate. Security lights glowed against stone walls, guarded by men who bowed respectfully as the vehicle passed. Aurelia had never seen such quiet discipline. When the car stopped, Marco stepped out first and gestured for her to follow. She hesitated, uncertain whether she was safe or trapped in another kind of danger, but the calm in his eyes, steady and composed, made her take his hand once more. The front doors opened, revealing a mansion that felt both beautiful and impenetrable. Inside, everything gleamed with understated wealth: polished floors, marble columns, dim gold lighting. The silence was complete except for distant footsteps of staff who moved efficiently without question. Marco directed a woman in uniform to prepare a room for Aurelia. When he turned back to her, his expression softened slightly. He told her to rest, saying she needed safety more than explanations tonight. Aurelia nodded, too drained to argue. As she walked down the long hallway, she felt her knees weaken, not from fear but from the sudden weight of being out of Cassian's control for the first time. Before we continue and see what happens next inside that mansion, take a moment to support this story by liking the video and subscribing if you haven't already. It helps more than you think and tells me you want more stories like this. As Aurelia's door closed behind her, Marco remained in the hall, lost in thought. His assistant approached quietly, asking if they should notify anyone about the incident at the gala. Marco shook his head. He didn't need to. Word would spread on its own. He instructed his staff to tighten security and ensure Aurelia wasn't disturbed. His tone was calm, but beneath it was an edge of anger rarely seen by his men. Protecting her wasn't just an act of mercy, it was personal, though he hadn't yet told anyone why. Aurelia sat on the edge of a massive bed, her body still trembling from the night's chaos. The room was elegant yet unfamiliar, filled with quiet shadows and the faint scent of cedar. A tray of food had been placed beside her, untouched. Her reflection in the window looked pale, eyes hollow from years of fear. She pressed a hand over her stomach, feeling the baby move faintly, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. For the first time in a long while, she let herself breathe without worrying about footsteps approaching from behind. Cassian, meanwhile, paced in his study back at the penthouse. His fury burned hotter with every passing minute. News outlets had already begun whispering about his scene at the gala. His publicist called repeatedly, advising damage control, but Cassian ignored her. He poured himself a drink instead, replaying the humiliation in his mind, the whispers, the stares, the Mafia Boss stepping in. He slammed the glass on the desk, shards scattering across the floor. No one had ever embarrassed him before, and he swore he'd make them regret it, especially the woman he believed belonged to him. The following morning brought gray skies. Aurelia woke to the sound of quiet footsteps outside her door. A gentle knock followed, and a woman entered carrying breakfast. Her tone was kind, her movements unhurried, a sharp contrast to the tension Aurelia was used to. The woman introduced herself as Lydia, head of the household staff, assuring Aurelia she was safe. Aurelia nodded politely, but still couldn't shake her unease. She didn't understand why Marco, a man of his reputation, would risk his name for her. Gratitude and confusion tangled inside her as she began to eat. Marco entered the room later, carrying a folder under his arm. He greeted her briefly before asking if she was in pain. She replied softly that she was fine, though her voice trembled slightly. Marco placed the folder on the table and told her the house doctor would check on her soon. Then, without warning, he said he knew who she was. Aurelia looked up sharply. He explained he had seen her years ago in a hospital hallway when she saved a child's life without hesitation. She frowned, unsure how that connected to him. Marco told her the child she saved had been his niece. He remembered walking into that hospital and finding her a stranger then, kneeling by the little girl's bed, whispering comfort. Aurelia's mind raced, piecing together faint memories of that day. She had no idea who the family was at the time. Marco said she had left before he could thank her, but he never forgot her face. Since then he had quietly kept an eye on her, sensing something in her life wasn't right, though he hadn't known the full truth until the gala. Aurelia listened in stunned silence. The story felt unreal, almost impossible, yet his sincerity was undeniable. She asked why he never intervened before. Marco said that he had no proof, only suspicions, and interfering without cause could have made things worse for her. But last night gave him all the proof he needed. Aurelia felt tears rising, but not from sadness. For once someone had seen her pain and believed it without forcing her to explain. That small mercy broke something open inside her, releasing years of quiet suffering she had held too tightly. Cassian's rage festered through the day. He met with his lawyer, who advised him to stay quiet until things settled. But Cassian couldn't accept that. He needed control back. He began calling contacts across the city, asking about Marco Leone's connections. Few dared to speak. Those who did warned him against making an enemy of the Mafia Boss. But Cassian's pride outweighed reason. He swore he'd find his wife and bring her home, even if it meant crossing lines that could destroy him. His obsession grew, feeding on the humiliation he refused to forget. At the Leone estate, Aurelia slowly adjusted to her new surroundings. The staff treated her with quiet respect, never prying or gossiping. Her room overlooked a private garden, and she often sat by the window, sketching small flowers on scraps of paper to calm herself. Marco kept his distance, only checking in through Lelia. Still, she could feel his unseen presence around her. Every locked gate, every guard stationed nearby, every subtle measure meant to keep her safe. For a man known for violence, his protection carried an unexpected gentleness she couldn't quite understand. Days passed, and the rhythm of safety began to settle in. Aurelia found herself walking the garden paths in the evenings, the scent of jasmine drifting through the air. Sometimes she caught glimpses of Marco talking to his men by the courtyard, his tone steady and his authority absolute. Yet when their eyes met, he would nod politely, almost with respect. It confused her. This man who could command fear so easily treated her as if her presence mattered. It was a quiet contradiction that began to shift something deep within her heart. Cassian spent his nights in front of his computer, scrolling through photos from the gala. Each image made his blood boil, especially the one where Marco stopped him. The image had spread online, turning him into a public villain overnight. Investors began withdrawing from his projects, and his carefully curated world started to crack. He blamed Aurelia for all of it. In his mind, she had betrayed him by letting another man intervene. His anger turned into obsession. He convinced himself she must be manipulated or held against her will. That lie became his fuel for revenge. One morning, Marco received word that Cassian had started asking questions about his operations. His advisor warned that Cassian's arrogance could become dangerous. Marco simply nodded, saying he expected it. He wasn't worried about Cassian's reach. Men like him only had power because others allowed it. Marco focused instead on Aurelia's well-being, asking the staff to keep her comfortable but discreet. He understood Cassian's kind, the ones who hurt what they couldn't control. Protecting her had become more than repayment for the past. It was now a responsibility he intended to see through personally. Aurelia began sleeping through the night again. The nightmares that once plagued her started to fade. She spent her mornings reading in the library, drawn to the quiet peace it offered. Sometimes she caught faint traces of laughter from Marco's men in the distance, something that reminded her of normal life. But despite the calm, a part of her stayed guarded. She had built walls over years of pain, and tearing them down didn't happen easily. Still, for the first time, she began to wonder what it felt like to truly belong somewhere. Marco's work kept him away most days, but his awareness of her never faded. He asked his staff for updates, without making it obvious. He wanted her to heal without feeling watched. Late one evening, as he reviewed files in his office, his mind wandered back to that hospital years ago, the young woman who stayed hours by his niece's bed, refusing to leave until the child stabilized. That same quiet strength now lived under his roof, and he found himself admiring it. He didn't understand why protecting her mattered so much, only that it did. Cassian's frustration grew unbearable. He began threatening reporters who covered the gala incident, using his lawyers to suppress coverage. But the damage was already done. Every attempt to control the story made him look guiltier. His assistant, nervous and pale, warned him to let it go, but Cassian refused. He pored over property records and phone logs, desperate to find Aurelia's location. Then one night, he received a call from a private investigator who claimed to have seen her enter a heavily guarded estate outside the city. Cassian smiled darkly, recognizing exactly whose estate that was. Inside the Leone estate, rain fell steadily against the windows. Aurelia sat by the fireplace, her hands resting on her stomach as the baby moved softly beneath her palms. Lydia brought her tea and mentioned that Marco was returning soon from a meeting. Aurelia thanked her and stared into the flames, lost in thought. She didn't know what to make of the feelings building inside her, a strange sense of calm mixed with guilt. For so long, she had been conditioned to fear power. Now she found herself safe because of it, and that truth felt complicated. That evening, Marco returned home, his coat damp from the rain. As he entered, he found Aurelia still by the fire. For a moment he simply stood there watching her in the quiet glow. She looked peaceful, almost fragile, yet there was a strength in her posture that caught his attention. He spoke softly, asking if she felt comfortable here. She nodded, thanking him for the safety he'd given her. Marco only replied with a brief nod before excusing himself, unwilling to reveal how much her presence had already begun to change him. Cassian's obsession turned dangerous. He arranged a private meeting with a man known for handling discreet recoveries. The man warned him that crossing Marco Leone was suicide. Cassian dismissed the warning, claiming he had the resources to buy protection. Money had always solved everything before. He gave the man a thick envelope and demanded results. The plan was simple: find Aurelia, take her back, and make Marco regret interfering. Cassian's delusion convinced him that he was restoring order, not spiraling deeper into madness. The men he hired, however, knew they were walking into a storm. At the estate, Marco's instincts began to stir. He felt the shift in the air that came before trouble. His network informed him that Cassian had started making calls to dangerous people. Marco didn't panic. He simply tightened the perimeter. Guards were doubled, routes changed, surveillance expanded. Aurelia noticed the increased presence but said nothing. She assumed it was normal for a man in Marco's position. Marco, on the other hand, knew the threat wasn't distant. It was drawing closer. Protecting her was no longer precaution. It had become preparation for what was coming next. Late that night, Marco stood on the balcony outside his office, looking down at the quiet courtyard below. The lights reflected off the wet stones, and the faint hum of engines echoed from the gates. He knew Cassian wouldn't stop until someone made him. Marco had faced rival families, corrupt politicians, and betrayals within his own ranks, but this felt different. It wasn't business, it was personal. Somewhere inside that house, Aurelia slept peacefully, unaware of how close the danger already was. Marco made a silent vow that nothing, not even Cassian's rage, would touch her again. Aurelia spent the next morning exploring the mansion, her steps cautious but curious. Each hallway held portraits of generations past, men in dark suits and women in pearl necklaces, who all carried the same sharp eyes as Marco. She paused at a painting near the staircase, noticing a small girl holding flowers in her hand. Lydia appeared beside her and mentioned that the child had been Marco's niece, the same one she had once saved. The memory made Aurelia's chest tighten. She realized this place wasn't built on fear alone, it was built on fierce loyalty. Marco appeared in the doorway, watching Aurelia study the portrait. His tone was quiet when he spoke, telling her that his niece had grown up strong because of her kindness. Aurelia smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. Marco motioned toward the dining room, offering breakfast. They ate together in near silence, broken only by the clink of utensils. Despite his reputation, Marco's presence didn't feel threatening. Instead, there was an odd sense of safety around him, something she couldn't explain. He treated her with patience, like someone fragile but never weak, and that difference mattered deeply. Across town, Cassian's life continued to crumble. News outlets released photos from the gala, and anonymous witnesses began confirming what had happened. Sponsors pulled away, partnerships dissolved, and the image he had worked so hard to create fell apart overnight. In desperation, Cassian started calling old contacts in the media, offering bribes to silence the coverage. Few accepted. His name had become poison. When one former associate refused to help, Cassian destroyed his phone in rage. The walls of power he once built so confidently were collapsing, and he had no one left to control. Back at the estate, Aurelia began to find peace in small routines. She helped Lydia in the kitchen, tended to the plants, and sometimes read on the terrace when the weather allowed. Marco's guards greeted her with quiet respect, their loyalty to him unshakable. Aurelia often wondered how a man known for danger inspired such calm among those closest to him. When she mentioned it to Lydia, the woman simply said Marco kept his word, something rare in their world. That truth lingered with Aurelia. It was the first time she had lived somewhere where promises were kept. One afternoon, Marco received a call from one of his men stationed near the outer perimeter. Cassian's investigator had been spotted nearby, taking photos. Marco gave an order to let him leave but to mark his car. He wanted Cassian to know he was being watched in return. The message would be subtle but clear. That night, Marco walked through the courtyard, thinking about Aurelia and the danger surrounding her. Protecting her had started as a moral debt, but now it had grown into something else, something he wasn't sure he had the right to feel. Aurelia noticed the tension that evening. Guards moved with sharper focus, and lights along the outer wall stayed on longer than usual. Marco tried not to alarm her, but she sensed his concern. When she asked if something was wrong, he told her only that Cassian had begun reaching where he shouldn't. She nodded quietly, understanding more than he expected. The fear she once lived with was returning, but it was different this time. She wasn't alone anymore. If Cassian came, he wouldn't find the frightened wife he used to control. He'd find someone willing to fight back. Cassian's private investigator returned with blurry photographs of the estate. Through the gates, he had captured a faint image of Aurelia walking through a garden. Cassian's chest tightened at the sight. The image fueled his delusion that she had been stolen from him. He ranted to his assistant, claiming she was being manipulated by criminals. No one dared to argue. Cassian made calls to men who worked in shadows, offering stacks of money for information. His pride was bleeding, and he would rather risk everything than accept the truth that Aurelia had chosen freedom over him. Marco called a meeting with his inner circle the next morning. They gathered in the study, a room filled with leather chairs and old maps. He explained that Cassian Drayke was crossing into dangerous territory, and that anyone caught helping him should be warned once, then removed permanently. His men nodded without hesitation. To them, Marco's word was law. He dismissed the room, but one advisor lingered, asking why he cared so much about this woman. Marco didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. He said she reminded him of everything worth protecting. Aurelia spent her days trying to find peace amid the tension. She began writing again, something she hadn't done since her college years. Her journal became a quiet outlet, a way to release thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. She wrote about the baby, her fears, her gratitude, and the strange comfort she found in Marco's presence. Sometimes she caught herself smiling, realizing how strange life could be saved by a man the world feared. But even as she wrote, she knew peace like this was fragile. Somewhere out there, Cassian was still hunting, and he wouldn't stop. That evening, Marco stopped by her room. He noticed the open journal on the table but didn't read it. Instead, he asked if she was settling in. Aurelia thanked him sincerely, her voice steady this time. Marco studied her for a moment before saying that Cassian's actions had consequences now. She looked away, knowing what that meant. She didn't want anyone hurt because of her. Marco told her quietly that protecting her wasn't a burden. It was a choice. Then he left the room, leaving her heart caught between gratitude and the unfamiliar warmth of being truly seen. Cassian began drinking heavily, his days turning into long hours of planning revenge. His home, once immaculate, became a mess of papers, liquor bottles, and half-burned cigarettes. The mirror in his office showed a face he barely recognized, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched, haunted by the image of Marco's hand gripping his wrist. He replayed it endlessly, vowing to erase that humiliation. In his twisted logic, punishing Aurelia meant punishing Marco too. He began drafting a plan not just to retrieve her, but to destroy everything connected to the Leone name. His obsession had consumed the last of his sanity. Inside the Leone mansion, life continued quietly. Marco's men moved efficiently, keeping any threat beyond the walls. Aurelia tried to focus on rest, but her thoughts often drifted toward Marco. She found herself listening for his footsteps, recognizing his calm authority even from a distance. When she saw him one morning speaking with his guards, his expression softened slightly upon noticing her watching. It wasn't affection in the ordinary sense, it was something quieter, deeper, and harder to name. For someone who had lived her life surrounded by control, this kind of care felt entirely new. One afternoon, Aurelia joined Lydia in organizing supplies for the estate's kitchen. Lydia spoke casually about Marco's reputation, describing how he earned loyalty by protecting those who served him. He punished betrayal harshly, but never without reason. Aurelia listened closely, realizing that respect, not fear, held his world together. When Lydia mentioned how Marco avoided unnecessary violence, Aurelia felt a flicker of admiration. Maybe he wasn't the monster the world painted him to be. The thought startled her. She wondered if she was beginning to see something in him that went far beyond gratitude. Cassian met privately with one of the city's most corrupt officials, offering money for information on Marco's operations. The official warned that such curiosity could end badly, but Cassian insisted. He wanted an address, blueprints, anything that would give him an advantage. His tone carried the desperation of a man running out of moves. The official hesitated before handing him a document containing partial schematics of the Leone estate. Cassian smirked, believing he finally had leverage. But what he didn't realize was that the document had come directly from Marco's network. It was bait, and he had taken it. That night, Marco received confirmation that Cassian had accepted the fake plans. He felt a grim satisfaction but didn't underestimate him. Men like Cassian, driven by wounded pride, were dangerous because they didn't care about consequences. Marco ordered his men to prepare the outer grounds for potential intrusion, but told them not to harm Cassian unless necessary. He wanted to handle this himself if it came to that. Later, as he stood by the window overlooking the garden, he saw Aurelia walking under the soft light of lanterns. The sight of her reminded him why restraint mattered. Aurelia noticed him at the window but didn't look away. Their eyes met briefly across the courtyard. There was no fear between them anymore, only understanding. She knew he was protecting her, but she also sensed his inner conflict. Marco wasn't used to caring for someone beyond business or loyalty. Aurelia smiled faintly before continuing her walk. Marco remained where he was, quietly realizing how much she had changed the energy of the house. What once felt like a fortress, now felt like something closer to a home, though neither of them dared to say it aloud. Cassian's men began scouting the estate grounds from a distance. They reported heavy security and advised retreat, but Cassian refused. He insisted that no amount of protection could stop him once he decided on something. He had become reckless, convinced that money could still shield him. One of his men warned that Marco's people played by different rules. Cassian dismissed the warning and told them to wait for his signal. Every ounce of his remaining wealth and power was now focused on one thing: reclaiming the woman he had already destroyed beyond repair. Inside the mansion, the days blended together in quiet rhythm. Marco spent most of his time in meetings, but his presence was always felt. Aurelia found herself thinking about him more often. His discipline, his silence, his unexpected kindness. It unsettled her. She tried convincing herself it was gratitude, not affection, but deep down she knew it was more complicated. One evening, she found a small box left on her desk. Inside was a silver bracelet, with a note that simply read, "For your peace." There was no signature, but she didn't need one to know who sent it. When Marco passed her in the hallway the next morning, neither mentioned the bracelet, yet something unspoken passed between them, a shared awareness that went beyond words. He asked if she had slept well, and she thanked him for the protection. Marco nodded, telling her the estate was hers for as long as she needed it. The simplicity of that promise struck her deeply. No one had ever told her she had the right to stay, to rest, to exist without fear. That realization made her chest ache in a way she didn't know how to name. Cassian's obsession reached a breaking point. His assistant quit after finding evidence of illegal dealings scattered across his office. Cassian barely noticed. His focus had narrowed completely to Aurelia and Marco. He began tracking Marco's known associates, calling in favors that pushed him deeper into criminal networks he didn't understand. The men he tried to manipulate laughed behind his back, feeding him false leads. Cassian's arrogance blinded him to the trap closing around him. Every step he took toward Marco only pulled him further away from the world of respectability he once clung to. Marco's intuition told him the situation was escalating. He met with his second-in-command, giving orders for surveillance around the Drayke residence. He wanted to anticipate Cassian's next move, not react to it. As they spoke, he found his thoughts drifting toward Aurelia again. She had become the calm center of his otherwise violent world. Protecting her felt natural now, almost instinctive. But with that came a fear he hadn't felt in years, the fear of losing control. For a man who built his life on precision, emotion was the one variable he couldn't command. Aurelia noticed how tired Marco seemed lately. He moved through the house with the quiet weight of responsibility. One evening she brought him coffee to his office, unsure if he would accept it. He looked up from his desk, surprised, then took it with a simple thank you. They shared a brief silence before she told him she knew Cassian wouldn't stop. Marco replied that some men couldn't exist without control, and Cassian was one of them. Aurelia agreed softly, realizing that was exactly why she had lost herself for so long and why she couldn't again. The next morning, Aurelia walked through the garden before breakfast. The air was crisp and sunlight filtered through the leaves. She felt her baby move again and smiled faintly, whispering a silent promise of safety. Lydia approached, reminding her to take it easy, but Aurelia insisted she felt strong. Inside, Marco watched from the balcony above. For a moment, the sight of her standing there, serene and unafraid, made him forget everything else. He thought about how close she had come to losing everything, and how far she had already come back from it. Cassian received a message from one of his hired men that night. They claimed to have found a weak point in the estate's outer defenses. Cassian smiled for the first time in days. He gave them the order to prepare for entry. His plan was reckless. Breaking into the home of a mafia boss was a death wish, but reason had long since left him. He packed a pistol, adjusted his cufflinks, and looked at himself in the mirror. The reflection that stared back wasn't the refined millionaire anymore. It was a man consumed by hate and obsession. That same night, Marco felt uneasy. He couldn't explain it, but something in the stillness around the estate didn't feel right. He called his security chief, ordering an immediate sweep of the grounds. His instincts rarely failed him. As the guards moved through the outer perimeter, they found tire tracks near the northern fence, fresh ones. Marco's jaw tightened. He turned toward the house, his mind already calculating possibilities. He told his men to stay alert. Somewhere in the darkness beyond those walls, he knew Cassian Drayke was closing in again, and this time, it would end differently. Cassian parked a few blocks from the Leone estate, watching through binoculars as guards patrolled the perimeter. He studied their movement, their rhythm, the pattern of light along the gates. His men waited in a second vehicle, restless and nervous. Cassian promised them a fortune if they succeeded, but even greed couldn't mask their fear. The Leone name carried more weight than law enforcement. Cassian smirked to himself, convinced he was smarter, richer, and more deserving. In his mind, Marco had stolen what was his, and he was coming to reclaim it, no matter the cost. Inside the estate, Marco reviewed security footage in his office. His team had spotted movement near the outer road but lost sight of the vehicle. He didn't need confirmation to know who it was. Marco gave orders to lock the gates and secure all entries. He didn't want a battle. He wanted control. His calm tone carried more weight than shouting ever could. The men around him moved quickly, knowing their boss rarely repeated instructions. Marco looked out the window once more, toward the long stretch of trees lining the property, and waited for the night to reveal its hand. Aurelia was asleep when the first alert went off. One of the guards knocked softly, telling her everything was fine but to stay inside. She sat up, heart pounding, clutching her stomach. The baby kicked as if sensing her unease. Lydia rushed in, helping her to her feet. They moved toward a safer room deeper inside the house. Through the hall window, Aurelia caught the faint beam of headlights flashing through the trees. She didn't need to ask who it was. She had seen that look of madness in Cassian's eyes before. This time it was coming for her. Marco's men fanned out across the property, moving silently through the rain-soaked ground. He followed behind them, armed but calm. His expression was unreadable, his movements precise. To him, this wasn't about vengeance. It was about closure. He had given Cassian every chance to stop. A message had been sent, and ignored. Now there was only one way this would end. His earpiece crackled with a guard's voice. Motion detected near the eastern fence. Marco's jaw tightened. He ordered the team to hold positions. If Cassian wanted to walk into a trap, Marco was ready to let him. Cassian slipped through the outer gate using bolt cutters, his clothes damp and his shoes coated in mud. His men hesitated, whispering warnings, but he barked orders to keep moving. They crept across the grass, staying low beneath the cover of trees. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly through the rain. Cassian's obsession blurred every trace of reason left in him. His thoughts raced, how she would apologize, how Marco would kneel, how everything would return to the way it was. He didn't realize that every step forward was being watched from half a dozen hidden cameras. Inside the mansion, Aurelia waited in a reinforced room near the center of the house. The sound of rain and faint radio chatter filtered through the walls. Lydia stayed beside her, calm despite the tension. Aurelia couldn't stop pacing. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Cassian's face twisted in anger. She whispered quietly, promising her unborn child that she wouldn't let him near them again. For years she had lived in silence, shrinking herself to survive. Now even in fear she felt something new rising inside her, a quiet refusal to ever bow again. Marco moved through the courtyard, his coat darkened by rain. 2 of his guards flanked him, scanning the shadows with flashlights. He signaled for them to stay close to the walls. A rustle came from near the garden, followed by the crunch of wet leaves. Marco gestured sharply, his men spread out, circling the noise. They found footprints, fresh ones, leading toward the southern side. Marco knew the terrain better than anyone. Cassian was walking straight toward a blind corner. He adjusted his grip on his weapon and stepped into the open path, ready to confront the man who wouldn't stop. Cassian saw a figure through the rain and raised his gun without hesitation. The shot missed by inches, shattering a stone pillar behind Marco. Marco didn't flinch. He raised his hand, signaling his men to stay back. This wasn't their fight. Cassian shouted something unintelligible, his voice cracking from rage. Marco took a slow step forward, his voice low and steady. Cassian fired again, grazing Marco's sleeve. In one swift motion, Marco closed the distance, striking the gun from his hand. Cassian stumbled backward, slipping on the wet ground. The storm around them felt almost irrelevant now. The two men faced each other under the rain, soaked and silent. Cassian's suit clung to him, his once polished appearance ruined. Marco stood firm, his gaze steady. Cassian spat accusations about theft, betrayal, and property, claiming Aurelia as his possession. Marco said nothing. His silence was worse than any insult, a mirror reflecting Cassian's emptiness. When Cassian lunged forward, Marco caught him by the collar and drove him against a stone wall. The fight wasn't brutal, it was one-sided. Marco wasn't fighting for pride. He was ending a cycle of cruelty that should have ended long ago. Inside, Aurelia heard the muffled sounds of the confrontation. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to remain still. Lydia placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, telling her that Marco wouldn't let harm come to her. Aurelia believed her, though fear still tightened her chest. The baby moved again, a small reminder that life continued even amid chaos. She sat down carefully, trying to steady her breathing. In her mind, she replayed every moment that had brought her here, from the marble floor of that ballroom to this moment of reckoning beyond the walls. Outside, Cassian's fury turned desperate. He grabbed a loose stone and swung it wildly, missing. Marco stepped aside, letting him exhaust himself. Cassian screamed about money, power, and control, things that meant nothing to Marco. When Cassian lunged again, Marco caught his wrist and twisted it until the man dropped to his knees. The rain washed across Cassian's face, mixing with dirt and frustration. Marco leaned close and told him that Aurelia wasn't property. For the first time, Cassian looked genuinely afraid. He realized too late that the man before him wasn't a businessman. He was a reckoning. Marco signaled for his men to stand down. He wanted Cassian to face what he'd created. The millionaire's confidence had rotted into panic. Marco stepped back and let him rise, only to watch him stagger. Cassian tried to throw another punch but collapsed, slipping on the wet stones. Marco didn't strike him again, he simply looked down at him, calm and unshaken. Cassian's voice broke as he shouted threats, but they carried no weight. For the first time in his life, Cassian Drayke was powerless, and Marco Leone didn't need to lift another finger to prove it. The estate gates opened as flashing lights appeared in the distance. Someone had called the police, likely a nearby neighbor hearing the gunfire. Marco turned to his men and gave a single nod. They understood what to do. By the time the authorities arrived, Cassian was lying on the ground, dazed and defeated. Marco's guards had already disarmed him and confiscated the weapon. The officers hesitated when they saw who was present. No one questioned the scene. Cassian was arrested on the spot for trespassing and assault. Marco remained silent, his coat drenched, watching it all without emotion. Aurelia heard the sirens fade as dawn approached. The storm had passed, leaving behind quiet puddles along the stone courtyard. Lydia entered the safe room with a faint smile, telling her it was over. Aurelia asked if Marco was all right, and Lydia nodded. The relief hit her all at once, followed by exhaustion so deep she could hardly stand. She thanked Lydia and allowed herself to rest. For the first time in years, she didn't have to look over her shoulder. Cassian's shadow had finally lifted, and in its absence, she felt something almost impossible: peace. Marco returned to the mansion at sunrise. His clothes were still damp, but his steps were steady. He checked on Aurelia first, knocking softly before entering. She sat on the bed, pale but calm. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. She knew what had happened. Marco told her it was finished, and that Cassian would face the law this time, not his influence. Aurelia nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. Marco didn't reach for her, he only stood there, letting her see the man behind the name, the one who had risked everything to make her free. Cassian sat in a holding cell, his designer suit ruined, his hands trembling. The guards didn't speak to him except to deliver paperwork. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but the world had already turned against him. His investors had withdrawn, his lawyer refused his calls, and his name trended for all the wrong reasons. He told himself this was temporary, but deep down he knew he had crossed too many lines. The power he worshipped had finally betrayed him. There was no redemption left, only the echo of the woman he had tried to destroy. Back at the estate, Aurelia took a long walk through the garden after breakfast. The air was cool, and sunlight filtered through wet leaves. Every breath felt like release. Marco joined her quietly, his hands in his pockets. They walked side by side without speaking. She wanted to thank him but couldn't find words that matched the depth of what she felt. Instead, she simply said she wanted to live a life without fear again. Marco nodded, saying she already had, that surviving everything she did proved it. That truth stayed with her long after he walked away. Days passed, and the world began to forget Cassian Drayke's scandal. New headlines took over, but his downfall remained permanent. Marco ensured the story stayed quiet around Aurelia. He didn't want her to relive the pain. The mansion settled into calm again. Aurelia began helping Lydia with small household projects, and laughter returned to the halls. Marco watched from afar, admiring how quickly light returned wherever she went. He had seen empires fall, men die and loyalties shift, but nothing amazed him more than seeing someone rebuild their spirit after years of being broken. Cassian was transferred to a private detention facility after his bail was denied. The reality of his isolation sank in slowly. He tried contacting old allies, but most ignored him. A few answered only to remind him that crossing Marco Leone was a mistake. Cassian sat alone in his cell, staring at the cracked wall. The man who once demanded attention was now forgotten by the very people who had feared him. In that silence, he finally understood that money could buy comfort, but never loyalty. The world had moved on, and it didn't include him. Inside the Leone estate, Aurelia's strength returned. Her belly had grown heavier, and the staff treated her with gentle care. Marco made sure she had doctors available at all hours, but he rarely intruded. Still, he found excuses to pass by her door, or ask if she needed anything. She began to notice the way he lingered, almost uncertain of his place in her life. Despite his reputation, there was a quiet humility in him. The man who commanded fear across the city struggled to speak when faced with one woman who had seen his humanity. One afternoon, Marco received a message from his advisor confirming that Cassian's assets were being seized for fraud. Marco closed the file and set it aside. He had no interest in wealth gained through cruelty. His focus was elsewhere. As he walked through the house, he heard Aurelia humming softly to herself from the garden. The sound stopped him in his tracks. For years, his home had been filled with silence, a reflection of his own distance from life. Now that same house felt alive again, all because one woman had dared to exist without fear. Aurelia sat in the garden, tracing her fingers across the bracelet Marco had given her. It had become a symbol of something she couldn't explain, a connection that defied logic or timing. When Marco joined her, she asked why he had chosen to save her that night. He thought for a moment before saying that some things couldn't be ignored, no matter how dangerous they were. She looked at him quietly, realizing he had risked everything for someone who owed him nothing. Gratitude wasn't enough anymore. What she felt had grown into something far deeper and harder to contain. Cassian's former associates began testifying against him, each revelation adding weight to his downfall. Charges multiplied and prosecutors moved fast. His empire crumbled faster than he could comprehend. Alone in his cell, he thought about Aurelia, not with love, but with resentment. He convinced himself she had destroyed him. Never acknowledging the truth, he whispered her name like a curse, unaware that the world outside had already forgotten him. For all his power, he had become irrelevant. His final act of control had ended the moment Marco Leone decided to step between him and the woman he hurt. Aurelia began sleeping peacefully again. Nights no longer carried the same weight they once did. She spent her evenings reading by the fireplace, often joined by Marco. They spoke about ordinary things, music, books, the world outside the mansion. It felt strange at first, but comforting. Aurelia noticed how Marco's tone softened when he spoke to her, how his eyes lingered when she smiled. She didn't know what their connection meant or where it would lead, but she knew it was built on something real, mutual respect, trust, and the unspoken understanding between two people who had survived pain. The storm had passed, both outside and within. Cassian's name faded from the headlines, and the city returned to its usual rhythm. Inside the Leone estate, life settled into something close to normal. Aurelia often sat on the balcony, watching the horizon as the sun dipped behind the trees. She thought about the path that had brought her here, about the cruelty that once defined her world, and the strength that had carried her through it. Somewhere below, Marco stood near the courtyard, glancing up at her window, silently proud of the peace he had helped restore. As weeks passed, Aurelia's pregnancy reached its final stretch. The mansion adapted around her, schedules shifting to ensure her comfort. Lydia oversaw every meal, and Marco added more guards, not for fear but for reassurance. Aurelia often walked through the halls late at night, unable to sleep. Sometimes she'd hear faint piano music from Marco's office, a habit he returned to when deep in thought. She'd pause outside his door, listening quietly, finding comfort in the soft melody. The man once known for fear now filled his home with sound, and that sound made her feel safe. Marco's life had grown strangely calm. The chaos that usually surrounded his world seemed distant now. Business ran smoothly, allies stayed loyal, and for once there was peace within his walls. Yet, peace felt foreign to him. He found himself checking on Aurelia more often, asking questions he never asked before: if she slept well, if she needed anything, if she missed her old life. Her gentle replies always disarmed him. He told himself he was only fulfilling a promise to protect her, but deep down he knew something inside him had changed in ways he couldn't undo. One afternoon, Aurelia joined Marco in the study while he reviewed documents. She sat across from him, reading quietly, but her presence seemed to calm him. The sunlight streaming through the window caught her hair, and for a fleeting moment, Marco found himself watching her more than his work. When she looked up, their eyes met, and neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was full of meaning they both understood. In that quiet moment, two people from different worlds, one of power, one of pain, found a balance neither had believed possible before. Outside, the estate gardens bloomed brighter than ever. Aurelia often walked there with Marco's dogs trailing behind her, protective and gentle. She found joy in the smallest things: the warmth of the sun, the laughter of the staff, the simple act of existing without fear. Marco sometimes watched from the balcony, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had spent most of his life fighting for control over everything, but Aurelia had taught him something different: that some things were worth protecting, not because of power, but because they reminded him he was still human. Cassian's case began to unravel publicly. Each hearing exposed more of his corruption: tax evasion, fraud, and abuse buried under years of manipulation. His lawyer withdrew from the defense after threats surfaced. Cassian sat through it all in silence, the arrogance gone, replaced by bitterness. He still convinced himself Aurelia would come back, that she would forgive him once she saw him suffer, but forgiveness was a concept foreign to him. What he really wanted was control, and in losing her, he had lost the last illusion that his money and power could buy love or obedience. Inside the mansion, Aurelia spent quiet mornings preparing for her child's arrival. Marco had transformed an entire wing into a nursery, decorated in soft colors she chose herself. She was moved by the gesture, but overwhelmed by the generosity. When she thanked him, he brushed it off, saying it was practical. Yet she saw how carefully he had chosen everything. For a man whose life revolved around order and caution, this was a rare act of care. It was his way of saying what words couldn't, that he wanted her and her child to have a future untouched by fear. One evening, Aurelia asked Marco if he believed people could change. He thought for a while before answering that people didn't change. They revealed who they truly were when the masks fell. She nodded, understanding what he meant. For years, Cassian's mask had hidden cruelty. Marco's reputation had hidden kindness. It was strange how truth reversed everything she once believed. They sat by the fire for hours after that, neither speaking much. Sometimes, silence said more than conversation ever could. Between them, there was no need for promises. Their shared stillness became its own kind of trust. As winter settled in, the estate became quieter. Snow covered the gardens, and the world outside seemed far away. Aurelia often stayed indoors, wrapped in blankets near the fire. Marco joined her most evenings, reading reports while she dozed off beside him. He pretended not to notice when her head rested lightly against his shoulder. For a man who had built his life on control, the simple act of letting someone near felt more dangerous than any rival he had ever faced. And yet, he didn't move. For once, surrender didn't feel like defeat. It felt like peace. News of Cassian's sentencing reached Marco through his advisors. 20 years in federal prison without parole. The statement was short, factual, and final. Marco closed the file without a word. Justice had been served, not by violence, but by truth. When Aurelia asked about it later, he told her only that she no longer needed to worry. She looked at him with quiet gratitude. The shadow that once haunted her had finally disappeared. For both of them, the world had shifted. The past no longer held power. What lay ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it was theirs. Aurelia's health began to show signs of strain as the due date approached. The doctor insisted she rest completely, and Marco ensured every order was followed. He canceled meetings, rarely leaving the estate. Each day he checked on her personally, asking the same question, "How are you feeling?" Her answers were always calm, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. One night, as she drifted to sleep, he stayed by her door, listening for any sound. It wasn't duty keeping him there anymore. It was the fear of losing something he couldn't imagine living without. The early hours of morning brought an unexpected panic. Aurelia's labor began sooner than expected. Lydia alerted Marco, and within minutes the estate became a controlled rush of activity. The doctor was called, and a small team prepared the room. Marco stood outside, unable to stay still. He wasn't a man who feared anything, but hearing Aurelia's muffled cries behind that door shook him in a way no gunfight ever had. He couldn't intervene, couldn't help, he could only wait. Every passing second felt longer than the years he had spent building his empire. Hours passed before the crying stopped. Then a new sound filled the air, a baby's first cry, sharp and full of life. Marco exhaled, unaware he had been holding his breath. The doctor stepped out, smiling faintly, and told him both mother and child were safe. Marco nodded but didn't move right away. When he finally entered, Aurelia lay on the bed, pale but glowing, a small infant cradled in her arms. She looked up at him and smiled. The sight undid him more than he expected. He had seen life begin and end, but never like this. Aurelia whispered that it was a boy. Marco stood beside her, unsure how close to get. The baby's tiny hands moved as if reaching for the world. Aurelia asked if he wanted to hold him, but Marco hesitated. He had held weapons, contracts, and power, but never something as fragile as life itself. When she gently placed the baby in his arms, he froze, unsure how to breathe. The child's warmth spread through him like a quiet storm. For a man who had built walls his entire life, this moment cracked them all without a single word spoken. The following days blurred into gentle rhythm. The baby slept most of the time, his presence filling the mansion with unfamiliar warmth. Marco kept his distance but checked on Aurelia often, ensuring she had everything she needed. The staff adored the infant, calling him a blessing. Aurelia laughed at the word, saying she finally agreed. When Marco passed the nursery one afternoon, he saw Aurelia rocking her son to sleep, humming softly. He didn't interrupt. For a man surrounded by power, this simple, ordinary peace felt like the most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed. Cassian's name faded completely from the news. Investors replaced him, his company dissolved, and his estate was auctioned off. His story became a warning, not a tragedy. Aurelia didn't ask for updates anymore. She refused to give him space in her thoughts. Marco admired that. He knew too many people who let ghosts live rent-free in their minds. Aurelia had chosen freedom, not revenge. That strength impressed him more than anything else. Watching her rebuild from nothing reminded him of something he'd forgotten long ago, that survival wasn't just about endurance, but about finding reasons to live again. One evening, Marco invited Aurelia to the study. The fireplace glowed softly as he handed her an envelope. Inside were documents transferring a foundation Cassian had once owned, a charity he had misused for years. Marco had quietly acquired it through legal channels. He told her it was hers now. If she wanted it, Aurelia's eyes filled with tears. She realized what he was offering wasn't charity, it was restoration. The very thing Cassian had corrupted was now in her hands to make right. She accepted, her voice trembling, and thanked him for giving her purpose again. Aurelia threw herself into rebuilding the foundation. She renamed it Heaven Reach and dedicated it to helping women escape abusive homes. Marco funded its operations but stayed in the background, refusing public credit. The first few cases arrived quietly, frightened women, bruised and broken, just as she once had been. Aurelia met each one personally, offering shelter and understanding. Watching their faces soften with relief became her healing, too. She saw her own story reflected in theirs, proof that pain could turn into purpose. The mansion that once held fear now became the center of redemption. Marco watched from a distance as Heaven Reach began to grow. Reporters called it the most discreet yet effective charity in the city, unaware of the man funding it. He liked it that way. Aurelia didn't need him to protect her anymore. She had built her own power through compassion. Still, he remained close, her silent ally. Sometimes she would catch him watching from afar, that familiar, unreadable look in his eyes. Neither spoke of it, but both understood. Their bond no longer needed words. It existed in every action, every unspoken promise, every quiet moment they shared. Months passed, and Aurelia's life settled into something beautiful. She spent mornings with her son and afternoons overseeing Haven Reach. The mansion felt alive with laughter, warmth, and renewal. Marco had become part of that rhythm, always nearby but never imposing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she found him in the courtyard, staring at the fading light. She thanked him again for saving her life. Marco replied that she had saved his instead. For the first time she saw genuine vulnerability in his eyes, and it made her heart ache in the best way. Aurelia's son grew quickly, his laughter echoing through the halls. The staff adored him, and even Marco, despite his composed nature, couldn't resist the boy's curiosity. He often found himself being pulled into the child's games, pretending not to enjoy them as Aurelia smiled nearby. The sight softened something deep within him. He realized that after years of fighting battles, this quiet domestic life was what he had unknowingly craved. For once, power wasn't measured in control or money, it was measured in moments like these, where peace finally felt real and deserved. Cassian remained imprisoned, forgotten by the world he once ruled. He spent his days in silence, replaying memories of what he lost. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by emptiness. He never received visits, not even from distant relatives. The newspapers stopped mentioning his name. He faded into the background of history, a man undone by his own hands. His punishment wasn't the bars around him, but the quiet realization that no one cared anymore. Power without love, wealth without respect. It all meant nothing in the end. Cassian Drayke had become the ghost of his own making. Meanwhile, Haven Reach expanded into new cities. Aurelia traveled occasionally, speaking to survivors and helping them rebuild. Each story reminded her of her own journey and how far she'd come. Marco handled logistics quietly from behind the scenes, ensuring she never had to deal with threats or obstacles. Their bond deepened, not through words or grand gestures, but through constant, steady support. Whenever she returned home, he was there waiting, standing at the gates, as if guarding more than just a house, guarding a life he had vowed to protect, long after the danger had passed. Aurelia often wondered what her life might have been if Marco hadn't intervened that night at the gala. The thought made her shiver. She had gone from being property to being free, from silence to strength. Her son was growing in a world untouched by cruelty, and she had built something that mattered. One evening she wrote a letter she never sent, thanking Marco for teaching her that even the most broken pasts could lead to something whole. The letter stayed hidden in her drawer, a secret reminder of the night everything changed for the better. Marco spent many nights in his office, reading reports long after everyone had gone to bed. Sometimes he'd walk past the nursery and pause, listening to the quiet breathing of Aurelia's child. It reminded him of everything he'd lost, and everything he'd found. For a man used to commanding worlds through power and fear, this small sound carried more meaning than anything else. He realized his legacy wouldn't be in what he controlled, but in what he protected. And for once, he didn't feel like a sinner seeking redemption, he simply felt human. The seasons changed again, and life continued its gentle rhythm. Aurelia watched her son take his first steps across the sunlit garden, while Marco stood nearby, pretending to be uninterested but smiling anyway. The past no longer haunted them. The mansion that had once felt like a fortress now felt like home. Two lives that began in chaos had found peace, not through escape, but through transformation. Aurelia looked up at Marco and realized that some rescues last forever, not because of obligation, but because they're written by two souls who finally learned what safety truly means. As the years began to move forward, Aurelia's foundation flourished across the country. Stories of lives saved and families rebuilt reached her desk every week. Each one reminded her that her pain had turned into purpose. She no longer flinched at her reflection or felt trapped by her past. Marco continued to oversee the protection of Haven Reach quietly, ensuring her work faced no interference. Their lives intertwined not by chance anymore, but by choice. What began as a rescue had grown into a shared mission, two survivors creating a legacy built on strength, compassion, and second chances. One crisp morning, Aurelia received an invitation to speak at a national conference on women's advocacy. She hesitated at first, uncertain if she was ready to tell her story publicly. Marco encouraged her gently, reminding her that her voice could change lives. His faith in her steadied her nerves. When the day came, she stood before a crowded hall, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke of resilience, of pain turned to power. The applause that followed wasn't just for her speech, it was for the woman she had become after everything tried to destroy her. After the event, reporters wanted details, but Aurelia avoided sensationalism. She didn't name names or dwell on the past. Instead, she spoke of hope, of rebuilding. Marco watched the recording later that night in his office, pride flickering across his usually calm expression. He realized that Aurelia no longer needed protection. She had outgrown the shadows of both Cassian and himself. Still, he remained close, not as her savior, but as someone who understood what it meant to stand beside power without owning it. In her strength, he found his own redemption without ever asking for it. Cassian's health deteriorated in prison. Years of stress and bitterness left him hollow. He rarely spoke and spent his days pacing the same few steps of his cell. One evening, a guard handed him a newspaper. On the front page was a photo of Aurelia at her conference, smiling beside a group of women. Cassian stared at it for a long time, his mind struggling to comprehend that the woman he once controlled now inspired thousands. For the first time, he felt something close to regret, but even that came too late to change anything at all. Aurelia never heard about Cassian's decline. She didn't need to. Her story wasn't about revenge or karma, it was about healing. She spent her days teaching others to rebuild after loss, and her nights reading stories to her son by the fire. Marco often joined them, sometimes sitting quietly in the corner, content to listen. The boy adored him, and Marco's rough hands softened whenever he reached out to steady the child's steps. Their evenings were filled with laughter that echoed through the halls once marked by silence, proof that peace could grow where pain once ruled. As her son grew, Aurelia found herself reflecting more on the path that had brought her here. She had been broken, humiliated, and nearly erased by a man who believed love was ownership. Now she was surrounded by genuine care, by people who respected her voice. One night she stood on the balcony overlooking the garden, the same place where Marco had once guarded her silently. He joined her without a word, and they watched the stars above the dark tree line. In that quiet moment, neither spoke of the past. It no longer needed to be spoken. Marco's men often noticed the change in him. The once intimidating boss now carried a softer edge, his temper subdued, his decisions guided by something deeper than strategy. Some whispered that Aurelia had tamed him, but they were wrong. She hadn't changed who he was. She had reminded him what it meant to live without fear of loss. He still commanded loyalty, but now his leadership was built on something more powerful than control. It was built on respect. Even the most hardened of his men noticed how he smiled when she entered the room, rare but genuine. Aurelia's son grew into a lively toddler who filled the house with joy. Marco became a quiet constant in his life, never overstepping but always there. The boy would reach for him instinctively, tugging at his coat or handing him toys. Aurelia watched those small exchanges with warmth. It was strange how a man feared by many could be so gentle with a child. In those moments, she saw the truth she had long suspected, that Marco's strength didn't come from violence or power, but from the capacity to protect without expecting anything in return. Heaven Reach opened its third location in another state, and Aurelia was invited to oversee the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Marco insisted on accompanying her for security, but the truth was, he didn't like being far from her. The event drew hundreds, including local officials and community leaders. As Aurelia cut the ribbon, cheers erupted. She looked out into the crowd and saw faces of hope where despair once lived. Marco stood at the edge, unnoticed, watching the woman who had changed his world. She no longer needed saving, she was saving others now, one life at a time. That evening, after the ceremony, Aurelia and Marco walked through the quiet streets near their hotel. The city lights shimmered off wet pavement. She thanked him for everything, but he shook his head, saying she owed him nothing. Aurelia stopped walking and told him she would never have found her voice without him. The look in her eyes left no room for argument. Marco smiled faintly, realizing that, for once, he didn't have to fix anything, he just had to be present. Their silence walking back felt like an unspoken promise, neither needed to define. Time moved forward, and the once scandalous story of Cassian Drayke faded into history. People forgot the name, but the legacy of Aurelia's courage endured. She became a quiet figure of inspiration, not through fame, but through the countless lives she helped rebuild. Marco continued to work in the background, ensuring her organization stayed untouchable from corruption. They had found equilibrium, a life built on purpose, not survival. The world outside still whispered about the Mafia Boss and the woman he once rescued, but inside their walls, it was no legend, it was simply a life well lived. One spring morning, Aurelia received a letter from the prison warden. Cassian had died quietly in his sleep, unclaimed and alone. She read it once, and set it aside without a word. There was no satisfaction, no grief, only release. She went to the garden afterward, and sat beneath the willow tree with her son, letting the sunlight warm her face. Marco joined her later, sensing she needed no comfort. Together, they watched the boy chase butterflies through the grass. For the first time, Aurelia realized she felt nothing but peace. The past had finally ended on its own. As the years continued, the estate transformed into something new. It was no longer a fortress, it was a sanctuary. The walls that once echoed with fear now held laughter, the garden alive with color and sound. Marco's operations grew quieter, more strategic, focusing on rebuilding communities rather than controlling them. He had shifted his empire without anyone realizing it. Aurelia often teased him that even the most feared man in the city had turned into a guardian. He would smirk, denying it, but deep down he knew she was right. She had rewritten his story entirely. One evening, Aurelia hosted a small dinner at the mansion to celebrate the anniversary of Haven Reach. The guests were women who had once been victims, now thriving in their own right. Marco stood by the doorway, watching with quiet pride. As they toasted, Aurelia thanked those who had believed in her, her voice steady and warm. When her eyes met Marco's across the room, her words faltered briefly before she smiled. She didn't need to thank him publicly. Everything she built, every step forward, already carried his unseen hand, guiding her toward safety and strength. After the guests left, Aurelia found Marco sitting by the fireplace, a glass of wine untouched beside him. She sat across from him, the fire casting soft light between them. She asked if he ever thought about that night at the gala. He nodded, saying it often returned to him, not as violence, but as a reminder of choice. He could have looked away, but he didn't. Aurelia told him that decision had saved 2 lives, hers and her child's. For a man who had long believed redemption was impossible, those words felt like a benediction. The night grew quiet, and the only sound was the crackle of wood. Aurelia's son stirred in the next room, and Marco rose instinctively to check on him. When he returned, Aurelia was smiling softly. She said he had a natural way with children. Marco laughed quietly, admitting it surprised him too. They sat together in that warmth, 2 people bound not by obligation but by shared scars turned into strength. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of spring. For once life felt simple, and neither wanted to break the moment. Months later, Aurelia was invited to receive an award recognizing her humanitarian work. The ceremony was held in the same city where her old life once trapped her. Returning there felt strange but necessary. She stood on the same kind of stage where she had once felt powerless, now greeted with standing applause. Marco watched from the shadows near the back of the hall. When her speech ended, she looked toward him briefly, their eyes meeting through the crowd. It was brief, but enough to say everything that needed to be said between them. After the ceremony, Aurelia and Marco walked outside into the cool evening air. The city skyline shimmered with distant lights. She asked if he ever thought about leaving this life behind completely. He said he already had, in his own way. She smiled, knowing what he meant. Power didn't define him anymore. Purpose did. They stood there for a long moment, the sound of the city fading around them. Aurelia reached for his hand, not out of fear or gratitude, but out of quiet certainty. He didn't pull away. Their lives had finally found balance. Back at the estate, life continued its steady rhythm. The child grew, the garden flourished, and laughter became the soundtrack of the house. Marco spent less time behind his desk, and more time outside, helping Aurelia with small things, planting flowers, fixing fences, sharing simple meals. These moments carried more weight than all his years of power combined. He had learned that strength wasn't about control but about presence. Every smile from her son, every glance from Aurelia, reminded him that redemption didn't come from confession. It came from choosing kindness every single day. Aurelia expanded Haven Reach internationally, forming partnerships with organizations across Europe and Canada. Her name became synonymous with strength and recovery. She rarely gave interviews, preferring to let her work speak for itself. Marco handled the logistics silently, ensuring she could focus on what mattered most. They had created something lasting, something that would outlive them both. The empire he once ruled through fear had evolved into a legacy of protection and compassion. He never said it aloud, but Aurelia knew he saw this, not as her achievement alone, but as the redemption they built together. One quiet morning, Aurelia found Marco sitting by the window watching the sunrise. His hair had begun to gray at the edges, but his eyes were the same, steady and sharp. She joined him, resting her head against his shoulder. He told her he often wondered if his sister, the mother of the niece Aurelia once saved, would approve of the man he became. Aurelia told him she already did. Through him, she had given the world something better. They sat there as light filled the room, two lives intertwined by fate but sustained by choice. As the years passed, Aurelia's son grew into a bright young boy, curious and kind. Marco taught him lessons not found in books: how to be strong without cruelty, how to protect without dominance. Aurelia watched their bond deepen, grateful for the stability Marco had brought into their lives. The mansion that once echoed with loneliness now carried laughter every morning. Sometimes she caught Marco looking at the boy as though seeing a glimpse of the man he wished he had been. It was the kind of redemption that didn't need words to be complete. The day Haven Reach celebrated its 10th anniversary, hundreds gathered at the main center. The walls were filled with photographs of women and families who had found safety through its doors. Aurelia gave a brief speech, her voice calm and certain. She thanked her team, her supporters, and finally one person she said had taught her that even the darkest lives could find light again. She didn't name Marco, but every soul who knew the truth turned to look toward him. He stood quietly in the back, hands folded, his eyes filled with quiet pride. That evening, as the celebration ended, Aurelia and Marco stood alone in the empty hall. Lights reflected softly off polished floors. She told him she couldn't have done any of it without him. He replied that she could have, that she had already done the hardest part long before he ever stepped in. Aurelia smiled, saying maybe they both had saved each other in ways they didn't expect. They shared a rare laugh, one that carried no tension or fear, only peace. For two people once shaped by violence, laughter felt like the purest victory. Years later, stories still circulated about the night. A mafia boss stopped a millionaire from dragging his pregnant wife across a ballroom floor. Most treated it as rumor, a tale exaggerated with time. But within the quiet walls of a once feared estate, the truth lived on in gentler form: a woman rebuilding the world one life at a time, and a man who found redemption by protecting her light. Aurelia and Marco's names faded from headlines, but their legacy endured in every soul who found safety because one man chose compassion over power that night.